All right. Good evening, everyone. So let's get started with today's class. So I left off. We've done a previous class. Some of you may be, joining for the first time today. So I just want to discuss this. We have in our previous class we have discussed how reading skills are important, but what specific skill is there? One specific skill which can, if we work on that skill, which can help us with all of our VARC, right? It can help us improve our accuracy throughout the VARC section. So obviously that will boil down to our reading skills and one specific aspect of our reading skill, right? So, okay. So I just want all of you all to actually keep this idea in mind that there is, while you do all your practice every day for your CAT, for any MBA level exam like XAT, CAT, uh, we'll even include GMAT for the sake of this discussion, has this thing that we are supposed to read the passage in a specific way. They expect something specific out of us. So I'd covered this very briefly in the previous class, and to make the context of this class also relevant, I'll also go through that very briefly. So what do all verbal aptitude exams expect us to get better at? What skills are we exactly practicing? So again, think of one skill. If we work on a one certain type of reading ability, if we work on, which will help us with all of these exams, correct? So let's keep this idea in mind. So what I'd covered in the previous class was this, that all right, that the key skills required are, one is would be active reading and comprehension, correct? How to read correctly, how to read in an active way, what is expected out of us in this active reading process, correct? And the second thing that I'd covered in the previous class was analytical and critical thinking. We had discussed these as things that we are supposed to focus on, and they're going to help us with different question types. If you notice, active reading and comprehension will help us with main idea questions, vocabulary questions, purpose of the author questions, structure of the passage questions. It will help us with application questions, critical reasoning, multiple answers questions, paraphrasing, comparison, etc. So active reading and comprehension, in short, will help us with almost all the question types that are asked in the CAT exam, right? Similarly, we'll say analytical and critical thinking also helps us with all the question types: inference, function, structure, application questions, right? Critical reasoning, multiple answer, paraphrasing, comparison. So these traits or these skills, if we develop, they're going to help us with the entire VARC section. Let's keep this idea in mind. Now, how do I work on the skill? What is that one skill that I'm looking for? How am I looking at every day in terms of my practice? What is expected out of me to be done so that I can improve in that skill, right? So we'll get down to that. I want all of you all to participate, and I want all of you all to actually tell me what you think are the answers, and tell me what kind of challenges you face in your reading process, correct? So is there one such practice which can help master all of VARC, right? What such practice session would look like, right? So, and I'm talking about this from the point of view of one single skill that we are working on right now, is reading in a specific way, right? So in your practice session, the skill that I want you to focus most on is a certain way of reading and an approach to reading, right? So usually when we go through a passage, uh, or usually when we go through some reading material, we tend to pay attention to all the information in almost equal way, right? We distribute our attention across the passage in an equal way. What is expected out of an exam like CAT, which has the VARC section, is not simply reading and paying attention to all the information all the time. The exams expect us to selectively attend to certain parts of the passage. So how do I know which parts of the passage I'm supposed to focus on? And how do I figure out what the passage is trying to say, right? So there are two challenges when it comes to this skill of reading selectively, correct? We'll define the skill further, but I just want to talk about it for a few moments. So this skill that we are trying to read selectively, this skill involves us reading the passage in a specific way, which obviously means we are going to simplify and then evaluate all information, right? We need to have the ability to do this. And the reason why I said all information is because the passage can be from history, the passage can be from philosophy, it can be science, physics, it could be anything, right? and we don't get a title, and we don't get a subtitle. So we don't really have context. So the challenge that students most commonly face is, oh no, the topic is unknown to me, right? Or the title is unknown to me, so I don't know what the author is talking about. So when I'm actually reading, I'm trying to achieve clarity about these things. What is the topic, right? What, not the title. The title would be inferred by us in some way at the back of our minds. But I'm more concerned about what is the topic of the author and what is the author saying about the topic. Correct? Now let's work on this. Let's build on this skill further. All right. So just a moment. If you have any doubts, do let me know. Right. So the sentence that I want you to keep in mind is about topic A, author says B. Right. These blanks, I expect you to have the ability to fill these blanks using actual words from the passage. Now, the reason why I'm saying use actual words from the passage is because I briefly mentioned this in the previous class as well, is that I don't want my description of the passage to create any problems, right? I don't want to filter the passage through my description. I want to use actual words given by the author to figure out what the passage is about, right? About topic A, the author says B. Now, by the way, we can use this to figure out reading comprehensions. We can use this to figure out para completion questions. We can use this to figure out critical reasoning questions. We can use this to figure out para summary questions. We can use this to figure out para jumble odd and para jumble questions as well, right? In these questions, it's a little hard, but the objective is that if we can figure out what the topic is and what specifically about the topic the author is saying, putting this or filling these blanks, putting these two blanks together, we basically get the author's main point. All right. Now, the challenge that students face is that I can't figure out the main point for this passage because this passage is about philosophy, let's say, right? Not only don't I know many words, right? The sentence length is also very long. So to figure out the passage, to make progress in the passage is very hard for me. I take a lot of time, suppose, right? So what do I do? What is the reading process that I use? By the way, those of you who have missed the previous class, please go ahead and watch it again. And I guarantee you that it will be of some use to you, and it will help you build on what we are doing in this class, right? So I've briefly covered what is expected of us. What is expected of us is that I can reduce any topic, any kind of passage, any kind of question to this idea, right? About a certain topic, the author is saying some specific thing. If I can reduce the passage to this idea, most of the questions that are asked in this case become very easy to answer, right? Because we have clarity. So I'm going to layer a lot of information into today's class. I just want all of you to stay focused and be attentive. We'll go through two questions, or rather two passages, right? One is a previous year CAT passage, one is a previous year ZAT passage. My objective is to show you through today's class that this idea, if you really practice well, you're going to improve your accuracy significantly, right? And it'll give you clarity about your decisions in the exam. A lot of times what happens in the exam is when we are comparing options, students get stuck in two options, right? Maybe students are stuck in A and B, right? And then we tend to just read in a circular fashion, and then we'll eventually jump to some conclusion. We'll say, okay, I'll just go with D. D looks the most promising. I'm going with D. Why that decision was taken is not known to us. Most of the time, it's just because of some circular thinking, and we are running out of time, so we jump to a conclusion. So my point is that if we have this sort of outlook, we'll have clarity about the decision making process, right? This behavior of reading options, especially when options clash, of reading options in a circular fashion, this behavior will reduce significantly again. Correct? So let's keep this idea in mind and let's move ahead. Okay. So what I want you to consider is about topic, right? About topic A. So topic is our subject. Author says B is our predicate, right? Author says something, right? Now, subject and predicate is obviously, we've studied this in school grammar. I don't want to get into the grammar part of it, but it essentially breaks down one sentence into what is the main topic of the sentence and what about it is the author saying. Correct? That's what subject and predicate breaks down each sentence that we read into. Now, why is this important? See, this gets important especially because, like I said again, let's go back to our understanding of a difficult passage. This gets especially important because when there is a long sentence, and you'll notice this in especially like the longer passages of cat, you'll notice sometimes sentences run into 3 lines. Okay. Now, what happens is we have to reread this sentence maybe twice. Sometimes we even have to read it thrice, which is natural. But a lot of times we read it again in the same fashion without making any head or tail of it. Correct? But what I want you to consciously figure out by the second reading is what is the subject of the sentence? What is the main topic of conversation here? Now, stringing together multiple such topics of conversation, right? If you figure out the topic for, let's say, topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, for each of these sentences, you can figure out the main subject or main topic of the author. Not only can you figure out the main topic of the author, but you can, if not clearly, at least vaguely, figure out what about the passage the author is saying. What about the topic? Sorry, what about the topic the author is saying? Right? You can figure out vaguely what about the topic, or what is the predicate basically. What about the topic the author is saying? So usually we would have faced a challenge with a long sentence like this, which is 4 lines long, and we end up instead retaining facts and information. When we read a long sentence, we end up trying to retain facts or information. This is actually not necessary. In fact, I would say it's not important. What is important is I figure out what the topic of that sentence is. Because if I want to figure out what fact is being asked, so then when it comes to the question, I'll go to the passage and check again, right? I'll pay attention to the options. And if an option mentions a specific fact, I'll go to the passage and check whether that fact is mentioned correctly or incorrectly. So retaining or remembering facts and information is actually useless. What is useful is figuring out what is the topic of the author and what generally the author is saying about the topic without retaining any facts. So we are going to do this exercise. We are going to do this exercise for 2 different questions. And my objective is that through today's class, through this pursuit of about topic A, the author says B, through this pursuit, and through understanding this concept of subject and predicate, we can master all question types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a passage, right? This is a CAT 2023 passage, and I'll just wait for a moment. Some of you may have seen this passage before, but I just wanted to go through this passage really carefully, right? And really carefully meaning like how you would read it in the exam. And what I want you to try to do is identify the subject of each sentence. So I'll give you a starter. Heat waves is the topic of the first sentence, right? Heat waves are becoming longer, frequent, and intense due to climate change. So I'll just pause for a minute. I want you to figure out the subject of each of the sentences. Go ahead and read the passage. I'll discuss each sentence of it. All right. So I it's enough time for us to at least read the passage. What I'm going to do is show you a slide where the subject of each sentence is marked. So let's see how this works, right? Heat waves are becoming longer, frequent, and intense due to climate change. So the subject of the first sentence was heat waves. And the predicate, which is basically about the topic, what is the author saying? It's the author is telling us that heat waves are becoming longer, and the cause of that is told to us, correct? Now let's take a look at the sentence after that. The impacts of extreme heat are unevenly experienced, with older people and young children, those with pre-existing medical conditions and on low income, significantly more vulnerable. So I want all of you all to, by the way, when I say subject and predicate, I don't want you to get started thinking, oh no, I need to work on grammar or anything like that. Think quite simply about this. Think, what is the topic? The topic here is impacts of extreme heat. What about the topic the author is saying? This is making people more vulnerable, right? Especially older, younger, but some specific group of people is becoming more vulnerable due to impact of extreme heat. So we know exactly what the second sentence is trying to tell us. Now let's look at the third sentence. Adaptation to heat waves is a significant public policy concern. We know adaptation to heat waves is the subject of conversation here, and this is the predicate, right? Fairly easy. Now for the fourth sentence, research conducted among at-risk people in the UK. So this is the subject. About this subject, the author tells us that this reveals even vulnerable people do not perceive themselves at risk. Therefore, early warning of extreme heat events do not perform as intended. So this sentence is given to tell us, the subject of this sentence is, of course, research conducted among at-risk people in the UK. Right? This is given to tell us that based on the research, they know that warnings don't work well, right? Because people do not perceive themselves at risk. Since people don't perceive themselves at risk, warnings don't work well, correct? Okay. Now the next sentence, this suggests, this here the subject actually is the outcome of research suggests that understanding how extreme heat is narrated is very important. See, if you notice here, the problem was people don't perceive risk, correct? So this was what the outcome of the research told us. So this outcome of the research, that is, people don't perceive risk, right? This outcome of the research, the author says that we can improve this if we know how to narrate extreme heat and its effects. Basically, we should explain how extreme heat impacts people more in a much more efficient way, right? And this is the last sentence. The author is giving us a solution to the problem, right? And you'll notice this actually. Many passages have this problem solution format, right? The author will present us with a problem. Problems are different. Maybe a theory is not robust. Maybe in this case, people don't pay attention to warnings, and then a solution is provided. Here, solution is the news media, which is the subject, play a central role, and it can help people, warn about the potential dangers, etc. So let's take a look at this. Right. So now that we have our passage here, I've marked the subject of each passage. Heat waves are becoming more longer, the impacts of extreme heat, adaptation to heat waves, research, what is research revealing to us? This suggests, this we know this is the outcome of the research, right? Like I discussed, and news media. So if I was to reduce this to our previous conversation, which is about a certain topic, right? This entire thing about a certain topic, the author is saying something specific, right? If I was to reduce this passage to this, now what would you fill in blank A, right? What would you consider filling in blank A? By the way, those of you who've joined late, I just want to tell you that we are discussing, just a moment. We are discussing breaking down passages into this subject, predicate, or topic of the author way, right? A few of you I notice have joined late. And my objective is to show you that we can reduce all of our CAT VARC questions to this concept, right? We can reduce everything that we do in the VARC process to this concept, that about a certain topic, the author says something specific, right? This is a previous year passage, and you'll notice that I have marked the subject of each sentence. Now let's look at the next slide. I've given you some time to figure out what would you enter in blank A. Blank B is the rest of the half of the sentences. So blank B is a little harder to fill, harder in terms of words, but we'll figure out, right? Let's see what blank A is going to be. Most of you are going to say heat waves in blank A, which is good enough, which works, right? So let's say about topic which is impacts of extreme heat, right? Heat waves and impacts of extreme heat, right? So the topic of discussion is the impact of extreme heat, correct? This is clear to us. The author says specifically about this topic, heat waves are intensifying due to, so the cause is mentioned in the predicate, right? The cause is told to us why is it happening due to climate change and affect vulnerable groups more, who it affects more. Adaptation is a public policy concern, right? Adaptation is a concern which was told to us, but many don't perceive the risk. So here is a problem. And how do we solve this problem? We solve the problem using media, correct? Now, to answer a very pertinent question is, do we have time to do this in the exam? And no, you don't have time to do this in the exam. And I don't expect you to do this in this granular, very slow way. What I want you to reduce the passage to is this, correct? And to figure out this, initially, we need to be able to do this part very carefully, which is what I'm trying to show you, right? In your everyday practice, if you can repeat this part carefully, if you can do this part carefully, your overall accuracy for CAT is going to improve, and your ability to do this in the exam will be, and it's, by the way, it's the same reading time. In fact, I would say that this process of reading is faster, okay? And in the exam, if you have clarity about the passage, your accuracy is going to be higher, right? So you'll be arguably faster, but your accuracy will definitely be higher, right? So we'll figure out about the timeline and how to employ this in the exam. But right now, let's figure out the strategy first and how to develop the skill. Correct? So we have figured out what the topic is. Topic is impact of extreme heat. And about this, the author is saying, what actions we can take. We can let the media inform the people better and people respond to heat waves better, etc. Right? Now, let's look at a question formed from this. By the way, this question in 2023 was asked as a para summary question. Okay. But what I've done, like I told you, if we figure out the passage in this way, our ability to answer questions of any kind improves significantly. So I want to I've created some questions. I want to tell you how to approach the passage in a specific way so that you can answer any kind of question. So let's try and do this. Which of the following assumptions is necessary for the argument about media warnings in the passage? Right? I'm going to wait for all of you to answer this question. So, which of the following assumptions, one of these assumptions is necessary for this to work? Right? This is the argument about media warnings in the passage. Right? This and this, people do not perceive themselves at risk. Warnings don't perform well. Right? But essentially about the last sentence of the passage. Which of these assumptions is necessary for the last sentence of the passage? Right? And let's go through each option. Option A says climate change will continue to increase the frequency and intensity of heat waves. We know this is nothing to do with media warnings in the passage. This is not a necessary assumption. A is invalid. B, vulnerable populations have access to and trust in the news media. Right? We are told people are vulnerable and they don't perceive risk. Correct? The news media can play a central role because this can help warn people. Which people? It can help warn vulnerable people, right? Vulnerable people. It can help warn vulnerable people, right? So B seems like a good choice. C and D have some problems. C says public policy measures are already in place. This is not necessary about media warnings. This is not a necessary assumption about media warnings. So C is invalid. And older people and young children are the only groups affected. We know this is obviously untrue and invalid based on the passage. So fairly easy. B is a valid assumption. Vulnerable populations have access to and trust in the news media. Now, if you notice this, we have done something specific here. We have gone from a para summary question. This is supposed to be a para summary question, right? Like I told you, we are supposed to summarize the paragraph into something which will probably, ideal summary would look something like this, right? An ideal summary. It will convey to us all the information provided here, right? We'll get to the summary question soon. But what I want to show you is we could answer a question like this, which is assumptions necessary for argument, in a much more clearer way than we would otherwise, because we had figured out the passage with utmost clarity. Correct? We knew what the passage is specifically trying to say, and therefore this is necessary that vulnerable populations have access to and trust in the news media. By the way, those who have done you know VRC classes with me, you'll know that the approach to assumption questions and checking an assumption, whether B is valid or not. How do I check this? I simply add the word don't here, right? Or in short, not. Vulnerable populations don't have access to and trust in the news media, right? If this was true, that vulnerable populations don't have access, then this part of the passage would stop making sense, right? We can cancel it out. This part of the passage would stop making sense. So in short, if I negate, this is me adding the word don't or not to the option. If I negate a valid assumption, if I add not or don't to a valid assumption, the passage stops making sense, or that part of the passage which it was focused on stops making sense. If people don't have access, news media can't help, right? So keep this idea in mind. This is what we do for assumption questions during classes. Okay, let's try and solve another question based on the same passage. Why might early warning of extreme heat events fail to protect at-risk populations despite being issued? We know this is a fact-based question. This is from a specific part of the passage. Please try and answer this. This is an easy question, of course. All right, so let's look at the answer here. Adaptation to heat waves is not a significant policy concern. This is obviously invalid, and this is not explaining why early warnings fail. Right? We are looking for an explanation of why early warnings fail. So this is not, adaptation is not a significant public policy concern, is invalid. The news media does not play a central role in this process. So some students may end up going with option B. It's created from that point of view. See, the news media can play in the future an important role. It can play in the future. So that tells us maybe at the moment it's not prominent. But media playing or not playing a central role is not the reason why early warnings are failing, right? Early warnings, the cause of early warnings failing is that vulnerable people do not perceive themselves at risk, right? So C is the correct choice. D, climate change does not affect frequency and intensity, is factually invalid. We know this is due to climate change, right? So D is invalid. All A, B, and D are invalid. C is the right choice. Okay. So again, keep the idea that we figured out this about topic A, the author says B. We figured this out about the passage first by figuring out the subject of each sentence in the passage. Correct? Let's try and solve one more question. This is an application-based question. Which of the following, if true, would most weaken the author's argument? Right? So I'll just wait here. This is a tricky question, so I'll explain it shortly, but I'll just wait. All of you all, please try and solve this. All right. So let's take a look at what the right answer would be. By the way, some of you may find this question a little tricky, a little new. The problem begins with not being able to identify the author's argument, right? In this case, I'm hoping that's not the problem because we figured out what the author's argument was. About the topic impact of extreme heat, right? The author argued heat waves are intensifying, it's affecting vulnerable groups, they don't perceive the risk, and media can help, right? So this is a longer argument than necessary, but we'll stick to it for now for clarity. So we know the author's argument. We want to weaken the author's argument. So we want to say, we want an option that will say, let's say option E. We read that option. After that, we should be able to say, therefore, media cannot help us, right? The author says news media can help us, right? We're looking for an option which will help us say, therefore, media cannot help us, right? And the words if true means we have to consider these options as true facts and we have to see how they impact the argument. I've gone through this question in classes in detail, so I won't spend too much time. The right answer here is A. Research shows that most vulnerable populations rely on informal networks rather than on news media for information during extreme heat events. So if you notice, option A is simply trying to tell us that vulnerable populations don't use news media. They rely on informal media, let's say. Right? We'll remove all the other words in the option to make it clearer for us, right? So please read the words which are circled. We'll ignore the other options for now. Some of you may have gone with B, C, and D. And, I can discuss that shortly. But just look at these three circled words. Vulnerable populations rely on informal media. These four circled words, right? Vulnerable populations rely on informal media. Firstly, I'm considering this as true, right? And if this is true, it weakens the author's argument. It tells us, therefore, media cannot help us, right? Government policies, let's look at option B. Government policies have already successfully adapted invalid. Recent study finds that already successfully adapted to increase frequency and intensity of heat waves, minimizing their impact. This is invalid because it doesn't affect the author's argument. We want an argument about news media, right? B is not helping us. C is also not helping us. It's talking about something else. D is talking about indicate early warnings, highly effective in regions with robust infrastructure. Again, not about media, right? So A is the correct choice here. Now let's take a look at the actual question that was in the exam. So this is the actual question in the exam, right? The exam had asked us a summary question. And I think our accuracy for this question would be significantly higher because we have read the passage in a specific way. So I'll just wait. Please solve this question, everyone. All right. So 4 alternate summaries. Choose the option that best captures the essence. This is the actual 2023 question. The right answer here is option B, right? If you notice, option A says protection from heat waves is important, but current reports and public policies seem ineffective. So protection is important, but current things are ineffective. This is actually true, right? Like many of the summaries provided in the actual CAT exam, option A is a great example. There's nothing really wrong with option A except that it does not include the solution given by the author, right? The solution is not mentioned and the problem is not defined well. We also want the problem to be defined well. Vulnerable people don't perceive risk, do not perceive risk. So we want, ideally, like I told you, our ideal summary is already there. I've discussed this about topic A, author says B. We have already discussed the ideal summary, but it should include problem and solution. No mention of solution or problem in option A. Problem is somewhat mentioned. The other parts of the problem are mentioned, but not in detail. Let's look at D. Heat waves pose an enormous risk. The media plays a pivotal role in alerting people to this danger. So simply problem and solution. We aren't told specifically about vulnerable people here, so it's still problematic. So option B is not ideal. We never get ideal options, by the way, in the exam, right? We get close to ideal options. So option B is not ideal. It has this vulnerable people don't perceive risk part is missing. You compare option C and D, and B will be the best choice. C says people are vulnerable to heat waves caused due to climate change. Measures taken are ineffective. Again, problem mentioned, no solution mentioned, right? So C is not telling us solution. And D says news stories help in warning about heat waves, but they have to become more effective. So D is obviously again true, but more effective. Why? Right? And why are we discussing heat waves? So option D is invalid. We can say option D is somewhat of an inference, but it's not a summary. Right? I want to summarize the entire argument. Now, picking between options B and C. Now, if you remember, at the start of our discussion, at the start of our class, I had actually gone uh, ahead and discussed this idea that, just a moment, I'll actually note it down here only. I had discussed this idea that when we have two options which are clashing, what happens is we end up rereading in this circular fashion. And by the way, this applies to all of us. So I don't want any of you to skip this part of the process. So since there is this rereading in a cyclical fashion and you're running out of time, you end up jumping to an option, and many students did actually end up going with option C in the exam. So people are vulnerable to heat waves. This is correct. Caused due to climate change. This is also correct. Measures taken are ineffective. Right? Now, why am I still going with option B as the right summary? People are vulnerable to heat waves caused due to climate change is the same as heat waves pose an enormous risk. Correct? See, if I want an ideal option, the ideal option should mention vulnerable people don't perceive risk. For this reason, the author is giving us a solution. Right? So the problem ideally has to be defined even in option C by saying that vulnerable don't see risk. Then the first half of option C would be close to ideal. Right? The second half of option C is still problematic. Measures taken are ineffective. This tells me that the solution which the author had taken so much effort to offer to us, right? This solution is missing. Correct? Now, just a moment. Let's go back to this idea. One moment. All right. Yeah. Let's look here. So heat waves are our ideal summary should say impacts of extreme heat are felt by vulnerable groups more. Many don't perceive the risk, right? This is a concern. Adaptation is a concern. Media can help, correct? So this solution and this problem are specifically why all of this was discussed by the author. Correct? The first half of the passage was explaining to us a specific problem. Specific is adaptation by vulnerable people to extreme heat is not done. Correct? And there's a solution to it. So, right. So to come back to our discussion here, protection from heat waves is important, but comparing options B and C. People are vulnerable to heat waves caused due to climate change. Measures taken are ineffective. The first half of option C has risk part missing, and second half has solution missing. So second half is invalid. Option B is the better summary, right? Notice I said better. It's not best because it's not ideal. Heat waves pose an enormous risk. Correct? Here, heat waves pose an enormous risk. That's right. Vulnerable word is not mentioned. So we have a problem with option B also. Vulnerable is not mentioned. Right? But it's better than A, C, and D. The second half is really good. Second half is ideal, I can say. Right? This is telling us the solution like it's almost written in the passage. So B is the right answer choice. Okay, so I actually don't want to extend this any further. As you may have noticed, we have a long passage I had a longer passage in mind to discuss with you. So I actually want to do this. We'll have another class for this, right? We have weekly classes. I'll cover this passage in the next class. So this is a ZAT 2018 passage. Okay. And let me give you some sort of homework. Let me give you something that, in the next session, it'll actually help you improve in the exercise that we have done today. So what I'm supposed to do in this passage, if I'm reading this for the first time, is I'm supposed to read this and answer questions. I don't want you to answer the questions right now. All you can go to a previous year paper. All I want you to really do is to figure out the subject of each sentence, right? Each sentence has a subject. Now, what I want to show you is that if we can figure out the subject of each sentence again, right, to go back to what do all verbal aptitude exams expect us to get better at, what skills are we exactly practicing? We are practicing this. The one such practice that we are trying to do is identify about topic A, author says B, which is our subject and predicate practice, like I told you. Correct? Sometimes you'll get a sentence like this, which is all right, it's not present in that passage, so I'll just show you the ZAT 2018 passage, and I want you to practice this during your homework. I also expect all of you all to tell me that in your comments, and in our future classes you can leave comments so we can actually make changes to our class process. All of you all can actually tell me if I can include some other question types which can help you understand this process. Okay. Now, in the next class, when you look for subjects from this passage, ignore these type of sentences. I'm just briefly showing you, right? Which type of sentences am I asking you to ignore? You will notice that some sentences, like this part of the sentence or this part of the passage, are examples, right? They're examples of some sort. So whenever an example is given, we need to figure out why it's given. The author is trying to justify something. Usually we are told about this before the example or after the example sometimes. But generally, examples clarify something for us. So don't include examples in your subject predicate process, right? It will just simplify your reading process in the exam. So I'm going to work on longer passages with you. I'm going to work on this skill, this one reading ability skill. I'm going to teach you how to apply this in the actual paper, right? In the time frame of the actual paper. So that's what we'll be covering in our sessions to come. So with this, I want to bring today's class to an end. I want to tell you briefly about, so this is a 2018 question of ZAT. I wanted to read and identify the subject of each sentence, like I told you. All right. And I just want to inform you that on 17 July at 8:30, we have, GP sir and Jijo sir, who are, really good. And I want all of you all to attend this class. They'll tell you how to analyze the VARC section. See, one of the challenges in verbal is that most students don't know where they went wrong. Like, for example, if I don't necessarily explain this, students wouldn't know why they went wrong with option C. Correct? If students don't know where they've gone wrong, they don't necessarily make progress. And that's a challenge in VARC. This doesn't happen in reasoning. This doesn't happen in quants, right? We know why we go wrong in reasoning and quant. But in verbal, often we don't know where we've gone wrong. So analysis of the verbal section is of extreme importance. You can learn from these people. All right. So I want to bring today's class to an end. I hope it was valuable to you, and I'll continue this series. Please add through your comments how I can add more value to the series. We are working on some specific skill which will help us improve our entirety of our VARC section. All right. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next class. Thank you.